Podcasting from the beautiful state of Maine, welcome to another episode of the Learning from Leaders podcast, the show that focuses on identifying and developing the skills and behaviors that will inspire, empower, and compel others to follow your lead. Listen as Patrick's guests talk about the powerful leadership approaches they have identified and developed, which are vital for leading in today's challenging times. These are the same approaches that will positively impact you as a leader too. Learning from Leaders provides the right balance of leadership research with real-world scenarios, making it easy for you to rise above your best. All right, let's start the show.
Hey everybody, I'm Patrick Verno, and thank you for joining me on another episode of Learning from Leaders. And on this episode, we're going to be talking with two experts in this space, Dr. Jim Loehr and Dr. Sheila Ohlsson. And we're going to be talking about their new book that was just launched, Wise Decisions, a science-based approach to making better choices. This book I found to be invaluable, and it's one that I will certainly reference over and over again. Just some background. Dr. Jim Loehr is the co-founder of Johnson & Johnson Human Performance Institute, which has trained and inspired more than 250,000 leaders around the world since its creation in 1992. Dr. Sheila Ohlsson, she is the senior scientist at the Institute for Applied Research and Youth Development at Tufts University, and she's also a visiting assistant professor at Johns Hopkins University School of Education. This conversation, to me, if you're interested in elevating how you make better decisions or helping others around you to do that, you need to listen to this. So let's get into it. Jim and Sheila, I want to thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I had the opportunity to read your recently published book, Wise Decisions. And as I was saying in the pre-meeting that we had, was that I was thinking back as I was reading this to an old model that we used to use in sales, which was called the Ben Franklin. And it was basically where you took a sheet of paper and you wrote a line down the middle and you put pros on one side and cons on the other. And that's how you help make a decision. And I said that really this book for me, as I read through it, was like providing the architecture that's necessary to make a wise decision. So it really was very enjoyable for me to read.
Patrick, thank you for having us. And I'm hopeful that we can create some real excitement for those who are involved in making decisions every day.
Let's just start off. In the beginning of the book, you talk about Yoda, and this is not the Star Wars Yoda. This is really something that is a theme throughout the book, and I think it's really important, right? It's your own decision advisor is your Yoda. And what's the purpose of that?
I would just simply say that we tried to really look at a really science-based approach to making better choices. And we try to look at where are these decisions being made? How are they being made? What are we referencing? And when you stop and think about it, we're referencing something. There is something inside of us. There's a place we go to make these great decisions. And we started putting words to it, and it came up your own decision advisor, and it just happened to come up Yoda. And we all have this special place that we go. And sometimes that Yoda is well equipped to make great decisions, and sometimes it's not. And the purpose of this book is to equip our Yoda so that it actually understands how to make great choices, how to make really difficult, thoughtful analysis of what should be done here, both in the short term and long term.
As I was reading, Sheila, in the beginning of the book, it talks about really the dynamic system that we all have between the mind and the body and how important that is. I was wondering if you could just touch on that as well, because I do think that is so critical, right? When we talk about good decision making, it's not just about how we think about it. There's so much more to it.
There's so much more to it. Thank you for bringing that up. We are an integrated dynamic system. The same biochemicals that are active in the mind are active in the body. Mind-body science is not fuzzy science. It's neuroscience. It's epigenetics. It's hard science. And we know that the things that impact how we feel, our emotions, also impact our physiology over time through various mechanisms, including the stress mechanism. But we're just a combination of biochemicals that are interacting in this sort of cascade effect below the surface that are informing what happens on the outside in this iterative process through life as nurture is shaping nature. This is the science of epigenetics. But we must look at ourselves as a whole. And our first chapter is on health and how health ignites wise decision-making. We simply can't expect ourselves to make balanced, grounded, thoughtful decisions if we're not in a healthy place. And this is multidimensional health. This is mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual health. And by spiritual, we're talking about our higher order beliefs and values, the things that really drive us to be extraordinary from the top down.
And along those lines, I think as I was reading this too, we have to unpack ourselves first, right? To understand, to not just make decisions, but as you say, to make wise decisions.
I think this is the real value of our book, is that most people, even Dan Ritchie, who wrote the foreword for our book, 91-year-old former chancellor of University of Denver, extraordinary human being, known for his extraordinary decision-making capacities, never really thought about how he made decisions. And so he never really unpacked the process. He just sort of did the right thing. But what he learned, and this gets back to our earlier conversation about parenting, we learn so much in our childhood. And Dan learned from his grandfather going through hikes in the mountains of North Carolina, but seeing how his grandfather interacted with people and helped people, was service-oriented, and just really stood up for the values and beliefs that were the most important to him. This is how Dan wired up as a little boy, as a 5-year-old. And this is how children learn. They're watching us much more than they're listening to us, absorbing how we as parents and the important adults in their lives make decisions. And these, because of this developmental period, it's called a sensitive period in development for children, childhood and adolescence. It's never too late. We're always a work in process as human beings, but childhood and adolescence are more important and stickier for embedding long-term habits and memories and ways of thinking about things, mindsets that tend to persist for life. So for all of us, to some degree, needs to be unpacked if we want to think about how we're making our decisions, why we're making our decisions, and think, do my decisions and my why, do they really resonate with who I am? Or are they someone else's beliefs that are infiltrating into mine?
Yeah. And I'll throw this out to either one of you, but as I was reading in the beginning of this, talking about unpacking ourselves, you talk about both the gatekeeper and the command center. How important are those for us as individuals?
It's really, the whole neuroscience of decision-making is fascinating. And the more you kind of get into it, the more you realize, you just wonder, how in the world do we make good decisions with all this that's going on behind the scenes in our brains? Every input into our brain actually affects kind of how we come to some kind of conclusion, how we judge things, how we decide yes or no. And what's important is that we have this thing called a private inner voice, which is very close to the area of the brain that is a central processor in making decisions. It's called the human insula, which is, there's no one place in the brain where all these decisions are made. It's a kind of a switching station where there are a number of areas of the brain involved. But a great decision actually requires that you check in with all these different dimensions, the emotional dimension, the intuitive dimension, the cognitive, really analytic dimension, and even our values and our beliefs, our sense of what matters most to us. And when we have a properly equipped Yoda, that we've been really trying to get all of those documents really in place. So we're not just making a decision on the fly. We're vetting it through a number of lenses that help us to make sure that we're getting it right the best we can. And that we want to habituate that. We want to make it more of a habit as opposed to we just do it in certain cases. And what happens is you start steadily making better choices. And when you make better choices, your children see you make better choices. And we tend to make horrendous choices. We look back on our lives when we're really very emotionally upset, when we're not in a good place, when mentally we're really confused and unfocused, and we're maybe filled with envy or anger, revenge, or whatever. We look back on those times, we go, how did I ever make that decision? And so it really is a process of understanding that we're complex creatures. And a decision is not just, oh, I'm going to do this. Some are very quick and very automatic, and maybe they should be because they're not that consequential. But a lot of decisions, which appear to be very just insignificant in the whole scheme of things, can contribute in the long haul to a cascade that actually is enormously important in the later stages of the way this decision plays itself out. So we want everyone to understand how to make great decisions and what are the lenses that you really need to vet before you make a decision. And the more you make that conscious, the less likely it is that you'll make decisions you regret.
I'd love to add one thing to that, which is just as Jim said, the little decisions form the foundation for the bigger decisions. But on the making choices around our children, it's particularly important under times of stress. It's those really stressful times where we're in our own crosshairs for whatever reason. It could be we had a terrible night of sleep. There are a number of things going on, but it's especially under times of stress that it's important that they see us operate and have a process to go through. And for me, as a mother of 3 boys, I use breath a lot just to really ground myself back into my body, to give me capacity to act rather than react. And it's really all about that because life is complicated and hard and frustrating sometimes, and things just don't go the way we want them to go. But having strategies for those moments that are precisely the teachable moments, just by walking our talk, when we're saying do this and then we don't do it ourselves, that just doesn't land.
Just what Sheila said there is so important in that you actually can step back and realize I am now giving an example to my children of how do you make great decisions under stress. Just that awareness can change the entire thing for yourself and for your children, as opposed to just going and doing whatever you want or feel in the moment, because they're watching that and that plays itself out in their life, in their generation. It almost looks like it's coded in the genes because it's multi-generational. People just not really thoughtful in terms of how to make good decisions and to clear the computer before you make the really big ones.
And back to your point, Sheila, in regards to nature versus nurture.
Nature via nurture. Since I did my PhD in behavioral genetics, really want to dispel, there's no nature versus nurture debate. It's nature via nurture through the science of epigenetics, where it's not one or the other. It's like mind-body integration. We're always working in tandem.
If I was raised a certain way and I was in an environment where this wasn't going on, it's trying to find an awareness of how I operate to create almost like a circuit breaker so that I can change how I then approach my own children.
That's a great analogy. Great circuit breaker. I love that.
Yeah. Having the reflective consciousness and the awareness to know where you are in the moment. It's almost like seeing above yourself a bit, kind of metacognition, seeing where we are, being aware of where we are. That is the fundamental starting point, because without awareness, we can't take action. We're a victim to our reactions, and that's just not where we want to be.
Now, it was interesting that you broke out preteen and then teen as different categories in terms of how parents need or should look to operate. And I was wondering if you could just speak to some of the differences there, because I think those are important.
Absolutely. So I think that it's all important. I'll just start by saying that it's all incredibly important, but the job of a parent changes between a newborn and a toddler and a little child. And then we get into different kinds of issues when we get into middle school and high school. And so our relationships with our children change, and each are different because each child is different, and the interaction between any one person and another person are different. So it's a continual adaptation of knowing who they are, really understanding that they're taking in everything around them. They're taking in everything. And I would say for childhood, for little people, love, connection, that early attachment is fundamental, knowing that they're seen, heard, and valued, but also helping them understand, setting boundaries around what is acceptable, what's not acceptable, and doing it in a loving way. It's very important that everything is encased in love, because when with children, with humans, we want to get along. We want the people around us to love us. So it's important to know that tone is as or more important than words often in our behavior. So as we're course correcting, doing it in a tone of like, I love you, I want the best for you, this doesn't work, this does work, and here's why. Even if they can't completely understand us, it's embedding at a bodily level. As we move into having different kinds of issues with our children, where it's around curfew or driving or other things at school, that requires a different kind of parenting. It's the same basic theme. Love is always present, but it's showing up as helping them, understand that they are making decisions. Again, being aware that they're making decisions because these are automatic, and then holding them accountable for the circumstances that unfold. One thing that I've done with our boys also is create our Yoda codes, which I write about in the book. Those are our 5 or 6 words that are the things that are most important to us, our code and how we want to show up. And so having a conversation about their Yoda code, was that kind? Was that generous? Was that grateful? Did that show integrity, courage, or humility? those kinds of things. And those are big words. And again, they're not going to get it in the first try. It's a slow drip process of just constant reinforcement over time. So it just becomes a part of who they are.
I think it's really important constantly with your children, whatever age. I have 3 boys and I have 7 grandkids, and to constantly help them understand how their life will follow their decisions. And decision-making is a skill, something that has to be practiced. And that the more you understand that your future will directly flow from the choices you make, and really constantly bring this awareness to them that you're making a choice here. I'd love to have you think about it, help me understand how you're coming to that decision, and to break it down and say, kind of, what are the outcomes you want here? What do you really know for sure is true? Would you bet your life on that decision? What are the outcomes if you get it wrong? What is the value that you're using to actually decide this is really the decision that really should be made? The more you make that a very important part of their growing up, our lives follow our decisions. The trajectory of our lives will most importantly follow those choices that we make, whether they're little ones, like whether I should have dessert or whether I should not work out in the morning and just go and skip breakfast. All those decisions matter. And that's what this book is all about. It's really helping them to understand. We make a lot of this intuitively and instinctively off the cuff, but we want to make this very deliberate, particularly with young people, so that they understand really their life will follow from this particular area of understanding and skill.
And so to reinforce one thing on that, the manner in which the message is delivered, often we're up against ourselves as parents, probably more so parents than grandparents, because there's a bit of a level removed there. But when anger just shuts down, if we're angry about a decision or a toddler's behavior or the fact that our kid came home an hour late from curfew or what have you, just getting angry, that's not going to help convey the point. That might feel right in the moment, but helping them understand what's happening inside of us, which again takes this reflective, conscious awareness to understand I was concerned something happened. Being able to message it in a way that can get into that command center that is encased in a message of like, I love you, I value you, I'm trying to do the best that I can. And this human to human connection that is delivered in a way that can get into the command center. Those are the messages that are really sticky.
Sheila, when I heard you talk about the Yoda codes, to me, it sounded like house values or our personal values. And I think of this wise decisions. Obviously, a lot of the work that I do in organizations, it's no different than an organizational value, that if we look at our values, it helps us to decide how do we behave? Are our behaviors in line with our Yoda codes? Right. And are the decisions that we're making, are those aligned with our Yoda codes? It really is like our compass.
It's our compass. It's our true north. It really is. Fascinating.
Couple things in here in regards to that impact the Yoda. You talk about managing emotions and managing stress.
Yeah, it's so interesting. One thing that I think everyone needs to recognize, and it's not something that is really fully embraced by a lot of people, and that is that our brains are always trying to get us to what we really want, need, and it helps us to survive for sure. But our brains, we have to be very careful because our brains can dupe us. If you really want something bad enough and your brain is really trying to help you get there, your brain can be the most amazing fiction-making decision maker. It gives you all the stuff. It biases everything so that you end up with the only choice you actually have now is the one you wanted in the first place. And so you kind of have to call yourself out and really understand that the brain is, you have to be very careful and say, I want my brain to make good decisions, wise decisions, and I do not want my brain to dupe me just to help me feel good that I get what I want. It's really a constant battle that we have to fight all the time, that we can get hijacked. Our logical, rational brain can get completely taken off track. And then the issue of stress, Yoda, if it's properly equipped, helps to really present the whole situation with perspective and with a sense that, hey, a lot of the things that we worry about, we can't control. And the things that actually are within our control and we can make good choices around, those are the ones we should really put all of our energy and effort into. And the more we recognize what we can actually impact with our choices and let the rest go, and understand where we want to end up. And at the end of our life, in 5 years or at the end of our life, we can look back and say, that was the best I could have done under those circumstances.
To follow up on that, just having strategies in the moment to be aware, but a strategy in the moment to take ourselves into a place where we know that we're in a place of decision making to get us back in the driver's seat. It takes that awareness. Sometimes it's hard to do it. I'm thinking about yesterday for me. In the morning, over the course of 2 hours, I had about 24 things happen that were minor stressors that all added up. And by the time I came to that, it built slowly. And I'm very good at dealing with big stressors, but the little ones that are the ones that build up over time, I just found myself in a place where I knew I was stressed. I knew I wasn't thinking clearly. And I needed to take a break from my physical surroundings. I needed to get up, put my shoes on, go out for a walk, look up at the sky, look at the trees, just feel basic physical sensory contact with the world and forget about my laptop and the emails and all the various details that have gone on. It's hard to think under those circumstances. So there are those situations where a lot of things build up and it's just time to breathe, get out. Being in a different physical place is very helpful. Walking is very helpful. But the other thing that Jim and I write about is our Yoda advisory board and having this small group of people who we respect and trust and rely on and know that they make sound decisions, and having these people to run things by as needed. Not expecting to do it all on our own and just dispersing it out, even if it comes out in a messy way and not neatly packaged, it will help keep us on track to make the kinds of decisions that align with our values and beliefs over time. One family thing I talked about in another interview was sitting down with our family and writing our own codes and keeping each other accountable for our Yoda codes. We can do this with friends as well, colleagues at work, to help us really stay where we want to be. And also there's a piece to this around feedback. If we're not aligned with our Yoda code in a particular situation and someone gives us feedback, how do we want to get that feedback? What way would we want to get that feedback? What are the right words? Because this can be a tricky personal situation, but figuring out how to make ourselves accountable for the things that we value the most, knowing that we're human and we go off track sometimes.
Yeah, there's a model, as I was reading through a lot of these sort of strategies in your book, especially around the kids, there's a model that I use in the work that I do around what I call CABLES. And it's an acronym for 6 behaviors that are all based on how do we build better bridges, stronger bridges with whoever we're interacting with. And the first bridge is, or the first cable is congruence or alignment, the walking the talk, right? And you talked about it earlier, Sheila, that if as a parent, what I say and what I do is not in alignment, then I've lost that trust with my child. They're really not going to be in a place to listen to me because I don't follow through on what I say I'm going to do myself. The S in the CABLES model is around specifics and it's about clear expectations. What do we want from each other? What do we need from each other to be in a place where our relationship is going to be as strong as it can be?
Yep.
It's very alarming when we come to realize that we are not what we ask others to be. We are, in fact, maybe almost a living example of what not to be at times. Yeah. And the more you can recognize that, because you cannot teach what you actually don't represent in the reality of your own life. It's hollow. And so good decision-making really requires that you show the diligence and the thoughtfulness, and you actually represent really solid decision-making skills in your interaction with as a leader in business. Everyone's kind of keeping track, and particularly when there is an obvious outcome. And the more we actually want to really represent to others what we want them to be, and we really work at that every day, we're more likely to lead them in really great decision-making in a very, very authentic way.
I'm thinking also that when we back to the fallibility of human beings, both whether parent, friend, leader, organizational leader, the importance of recognizing when we've gotten it wrong also. On the parent front, sometimes if I've not behaved in a way that I want to behave, I've gotten too frustrated or what have you, just going back to the boys and saying, guess what? This is what was happening. I was wrong. And it's very important to model for our children and just in human relationships that sometimes we do get it wrong, and allowing there to be some flexibility in what that looks like so that we can move together. Rigidity just doesn't work over time. It can work for short periods of time, but it does not work over time. And in all these contexts, but I'm thinking particularly parenting, the importance of just saying, you know what, sorry, crabby, this happened, but showing that we're vulnerable and just showing them that we can make a bad decision in a moment and then recover from it, I think is equally as important as making good decisions.
I fully agree with that, Sheila. I often will talk about it in terms of, I think there's vulnerability, and then I think there's intentional vulnerability where we actually proactively look for opportunities where maybe we were wrong and we haven't said it, but we do go to somebody else and say, you know what, I made a mistake here. That was my bad. I'm sorry. And I think that builds so much credibility for us.
It builds great credibility, but it's very hard. So many people just can't admit to the fact that they really don't want to see themselves as being that vulnerable. One of the great aspects of a great leader is they make great decisions. But no one really talks about the fact that even as great a leader as someone might be, they also make bad decisions. Yeah. They make decisions that were not really well thought out, and maybe the impact is throughout the entire organization. And that is where, as Sheila said and you said, a recognition that I really didn't work that through properly. I apologize for that. I'm going to get better. I think we all have to get better at making decisions all the way through the organization. That creates enormous credibility with the leader.
As I'm thinking about a theme that runs through this, to me, it's about slowing down. At times when we're not used to doing that, right? We become automatic on so many things that this is one of those areas where to make a wise decision, right, not just a decision, requires us to slow down.
Pausing between the stimulus and response, it's a sacred space. And in that pause is oftentimes the difference between something that actually is extraordinary and something that is a complete nightmare.
Yeah. I really appreciated at the end where you talk about storytelling and how we do that to ourselves, right? Which I think gets in our way of probably pausing as much as we need to at times when we already have a story sort of played out in terms of how something's going to go.
We are storytellers. Basically, that's what we're right now. You're getting Sheila and Jim's story, and part of your story is emerging, and it's kind of our view of the world. And our view changed the deeper we got into the science of this. Our stories morphed a little bit, and we began to realize some of the nuances that were not evident in our own lives. And it's actually helped us maybe to make more conscious decisions just going through this process. But we're authors, stories all the time. And those stories can be true. They can be false. They can be absolutely off the grid. They can be wonderfully inspiring. There's so many different kinds of stories. But the most important thing we try to do is get a story that is founded in the real world. It's founded in reality. It's factually based and reflects our deepest values and is not something that just pops up in the moment and actually is convenient. It actually has a grounding in something that when we look at this later, the story we told not only was true, it was inspirational, and it helped us get and others get where they want to go in life. And that is a critical component to great storytelling. And that's who we are. We are storytellers.
One of the last things as I read this was talking about the Yoda and getting home. And to me, it's sort of like the wrapping up of this, but it was powerful. I did that exercise, or at least the beginning of it, talking about the tombstone. There's a real power to that exercise that you're asking people to do at the end of where you want to be. I was wondering if you could just touch on that for a minute.
Our greatest gift that we have to give in the world is our presence, who we are, what we bring to situations with our family, our friends, our loved ones, our colleagues, and how we want to show up in life. There's this wonderful Maya Angelou quote, which I'm sure, but it goes like this. I've learned that people will forget your name. I've learned that people will forget what you said, but people never forget how you made them feel. And there's something so vital in this in terms of not just what we want to do, but how we do it. As Jim talks about getting to the top of the mountain, there are lots of ways to get to the top of the mountain. We can get there and climb over dead bodies to do it and elbow people out of the way or on a ridge. Or we can be collaborative and we can be intentional in how we climb up the mountain. We can help people. We can be kind. We can express our greatest values. And so as I was working through the tombstone exercise, that's really what I think about, just how I want those who knew me the best to feel the feeling they get when they think about me, the things that I did, how I showed up, and how I was able to help them feel, felt, and get to where they want to go. And so for me, that's getting home. And for a young person, mapping out all those, they're heroes in adolescence. They can do anything. Anything is possible. There's no risk and no danger. It's hard to think about the long term in life and where they want to wind up. Starting to inculcate some of these bigger concepts about service, about purpose, about the really important things in life that we know from science are the things that sustain us over life. Our people, our purpose, and doing something physically active every day are kind of 3 top factors that predict brain health over time. And of course, brain health is related to physical health. But wiring these things up early on, and as we go through our daily lives, aligning our decisions with those basic things is one step closer to getting home after every day. No matter how bad the day is or good the day is, when we can stay aligned with those basic values and beliefs, we're one step closer to getting home.
Stephen Covey is 100% right. He said, start with the end in mind. I think it's important to rarely like to think about our death and about the end of our life. But at the Human Performance Institute, I did this for multiple years. One of the most powerful exercises that we did at the Institute by far, we'd have people go to the end of their life and to actually inscribe on their tombstone the 6 words or 2 sentences that they really most want to be representative of who they were when they were here. And they spend a lot of really difficult, very thoughtful moments, maybe hours getting to that. And you normally don't get to choose what's on your tombstone. Other people choose that. But now you get to inscribe exactly the kind of legacy you want to leave behind. And then you move forward. And that really is how you want to end up at the end of your life. And that is what getting home is. Getting home is ending up where you want to end up at the end of your life. So then we're going to go forward. How do you get there? What do you have to do to be able to be represented or to be represented with those words that are, for you, the most important elements of your life? And they're powerful, and you can't get there with just wishing them. You have to put a lot of energy and effort. And then you bring it all the way up to the present moment. Well, what do I have to be doing now so that at one point at the end of my life, I can get home? The more you really have that as your true north, this is absolutely, for me, the definition of a successful life in the context of Jim Loehr, for instance. And then I'm going to have to work very hard to make that happen. And that, I think, is a key kind of lens through which you make all your decisions through. This is just getting home is fantastic. But then in the context of great decision-making, how will that alter the decisions I make with decisions about where I should put my energy, how much energy and time I should spend doing this or that with my family? And all of a sudden, you recognize you have a different prioritization than you ever had before based on what you now have defined as getting home.
In chapter 17, I think this is the getting home chapter. The quote that's in there is the Cherokee birth blessing. It's one that I had never heard before, and I will tell you that really resonated with me. And I think partly is today is my birthday. So as I read that,
Happy birthday.
Thank you. May you live long enough to know why you were born. I feel like for me, it was probably 40 years before I've really gotten to the place where I do feel as though I am here now doing the work I was meant to do, but it was lots of struggle and it will continue to be. But as I read through your book, it just resonated all along in terms of the work that needs to be done. And you talk about, you can't just think good thoughts. There's work that needs to go along with it to make that materialize. As I read that, I thought for my kids, that's the wish that I would have for them too, is that they live long enough to know why they were here, because I do believe we all have a purpose.
Well, that's the hard work, right? That's the hard work of striving to be our very best selves and make a difference in the world, leave our world in a better place than we found it. And I'm going to alley-oop a Mark Twain quote. The Cherokee birth blessing, which is the 2 most important days of your life, are the day you're born and the day you figure out why.
Mark Twain's, it's one of the greatest statements I think Mark Twain ever made, those 2 days. And if you have that understood fully, you're going to make better decisions.
What a great way to end this. I will tell you, I've appreciated this conversation so much. Now, selfishly, is there an audiobook coming?
I was just thinking about that as we were recording this. We haven't done that yet, but we have to. I listen to a lot of my things when I'm out walking and doing things. So yeah, TBD.
And I say that because to me, this is one of those books. I have a handful of books that I will listen to probably twice a year over. This is one of those books that I would listen to multiple times in a year because I think it's
we just haven't gotten to that part, the audible parts yet, but it's going to come.
Yeah, thank you.
And that is a high compliment, Patrick. Thank you so much. That means the world to us.
What's great, Patrick, is that you really read the book and you got the essence, and it's so nice to have an interviewer who has really gotten into it, and your questions and your thoughts really reflect that. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and wishing you both the best. Again, thank you so much for this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You take care.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Learning from Leaders podcast. If you've enjoyed the show, please feel free to rate, review, and subscribe on your preferred podcast listening platform. We really appreciate that effort. Until next time, keep rising above your best as a leader.